The story of the American Revolution between 1776 and 1783 stands apart from every other colonial independence movement in history. France's revolution would descend into the terror and produce Napoleon's dictatorship. Haiti's independence would come through the hemisphere's only successful slave revolt. Latin American revolutions would fragment Spanish colonies into competing nations. Yet the American Revolution created a stable republic from 13 disparate colonies, established principles of representative government that endure today, and demonstrated that colonists could successfully break from empire and govern themselves. The revolution was not inevitable. As late as 1774, most colonists considered themselves loyal British subjects who wanted reform within the empire rather than independence from it. The break came through a series of miscalculations by British officials who underestimated colonial resistance, provocations that transformed protest into rebellion, and the emergence of leaders who articulated principles of self-government that made compromise with monarchy increasingly difficult. What began as dispute over taxation evolved into war for independence that would reshape not just North America, but influence democratic movements worldwide. Great Britain emerged from the 7 Years' War in 1763 as the dominant power in North America, having defeated France and acquired vast territories stretching from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River. This victory, however, had been extraordinarily expensive. The British government faced massive war debts and the ongoing costs of defending and administering an expanded empire that now included French Catholic subjects in Quebec, Native American tribes whose lands colonists coveted, and 13 increasingly prosperous English colonies along the Atlantic seaboard. The colonies had developed largely through benign neglect during the preceding century. British oversight had been minimal. Colonial assemblies had grown accustomed to managing internal affairs with little interference from London. Trade regulations existed but were loosely enforced. Many colonists engaged in smuggling that violated mercantilist policies but was tolerated because pursuing violators cost more than the revenue gained. This informal arrangement had allowed the colonies to develop their own political cultures and economic systems while maintaining nominal loyalty to the Crown. The British government's decision to reform imperial administration and raise colonial revenue to help pay war debts shattered this comfortable arrangement. The Sugar Act of 1764 actually lowered the tax on molasses, but enforced collection rigorously, threatening the profitable triangular trade that connected New England, the West Indies, and Africa. The Stamp Act of 1765 required colonists to purchase special stamped paper for legal documents, newspapers, and other printed materials. This was the first direct tax imposed on the colonies by Parliament rather than through colonial assemblies. Colonial reaction to the Stamp Act stunned British officials. Protests erupted across the 13 colonies. Mobs attacked stamp distributors and destroyed stamped paper. Merchants organized boycotts of British goods. Colonial assemblies passed resolutions denying Parliament's right to tax colonists who were not represented in that body. The principle of no taxation without representation, which would become a rallying cry, emerged from this crisis. The Stamp Act Congress, which met in New York in October 1765, brought together representatives from 9 colonies to coordinate opposition. This was unprecedented cooperation among colonies that normally competed and distrusted each other. The Congress produced declarations asserting that only colonial assemblies could tax colonists and that the Stamp Act violated their rights as English subjects. Facing this unified resistance and pressure from British merchants, hurt by colonial boycotts, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, but it simultaneously passed the Declaratory Act asserting Parliament's absolute authority to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. This set up an irreconcilable conflict. Colonists believed they could only be taxed by their own elected representatives. Parliament insisted it had sovereign authority over all British subjects. The The Townshend Acts of 1767 attempted to raise revenue through duties on imported goods, including tea, glass, and paper. Colonial resistance resumed, boycotts spread, tensions increased. In Boston, the presence of British troops sent to enforce customs collection led to escalating confrontations. On March 5, 1770, soldiers fired into a hostile crowd, killing 5 colonists in what became known as the Boston Massacre. The incident, dramatized in engravings by Paul Revere, inflamed colonial opinion even though the soldiers were acquitted in trials defended by colonial lawyer John Adams. Parliament repealed most of the Townshend duties, but maintained the tax on tea as a symbolic assertion of its taxing authority. For 3 years, an uneasy calm prevailed. Trade resumed. Many colonists hoped the crisis had passed, but the fundamental constitutional question remained unresolved. The Tea Act of 1773 reignited the conflict. The act gave the British East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies and allowed it to sell directly to retailers, undercutting colonial merchants. The tea would be cheaper than smuggled Dutch tea, but it would still carry the hated Townshend duty. Accepting cheap tea meant accepting Parliament's right to tax. In December 1773, Boston radicals, disguised as Mohawk Indians, boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water. The Boston Tea Party was destruction of private property worth thousands of pounds. The British government responded with the Coercive Acts, which Americans called the Intolerable Acts. These closed Boston's port until the tea was paid for, altered Massachusetts' charter to give the royal governor more power, and allowed British officials accused of crimes to be tried in Britain rather than colonial courts. These punitive measures, intended to isolate Massachusetts, instead unified the colonies in opposition. The Quebec Act, passed simultaneously, extended Quebec's boundaries south and west, blocking Western expansion and granting religious toleration to Quebec's Catholics. Protestant colonists saw this as evidence of British tyranny. In September 1774, the First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia with representatives from 12 colonies. They coordinated a comprehensive boycott of British goods and endorsed a declaration of colonial rights. More significantly, they agreed to reconvene if Britain did not address their grievances. The Congress created mechanisms for intercolonial cooperation that would prove crucial when war came. By early 1775, Massachusetts was in open defiance of British authority. General Thomas Gage commanded British forces in Boston, but faced a countryside organized into militia companies preparing for conflict. On April 19, 1775, Gage sent troops to seize military supplies stored at Concord. At Lexington, the troops encountered militia on the village green. Shots were fired. 8 militiamen died. The British continued to Concord, destroyed some supplies, then began retreating to Boston. Colonial militia forces, gathering from surrounding towns, attacked the British column continuously during the retreat. By day's end, British casualties numbered nearly 300. The battles of Lexington and Concord transformed political crisis into armed conflict. Militia forces surrounded Boston, beginning a siege. The Second Continental Congress, convening in May 1775, assumed direction of the war effort, creating the Continental Army and appointing George Washington as commander. Even as fighting commenced, many colonists still hoped for reconciliation. The Congress sent the Olive Branch Petition to King George III, professing loyalty and requesting intervention to prevent further conflict. The king refused to receive it and declared the colonies in rebellion. This rejection pushed moderates toward independence. Through 1775 and into 1776, colonial forces fought British troops while still professing loyalty to the crown and blaming evil ministers for the conflict. This fiction became increasingly difficult to maintain. Thomas Paine's Common Sense, published in January 1776, made the case for independence in clear language that reached a mass audience. Paine attacked not just British policies, but monarchy itself, arguing that Americans should create a republic based on representative government. On June 7, 1776, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced a resolution declaring the colonies free and independent states. A committee including Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin drafted a formal declaration. On July 2, Congress voted for independence. 2 days later, on July 4th, they approved Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. The declaration did more than announce separation from Britain. It articulated principles that would resonate far beyond America. All men are created equal and possess unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Governments derive their just powers from consent of the governed. When government becomes destructive of these rights, people have the right to alter or abolish it. These ideas, though applied imperfectly by their authors, established standards that would inspire democratic movements for generations. Declaring independence was easier than achieving it. Britain possessed the world's most powerful navy and a professional army. The colonies had militia forces of varying quality, no navy, limited manufacturing capacity, and no unified government beyond the Continental Congress. American prospects appeared bleak. George Washington took command of an army besieging Boston, but struggled to create an effective fighting force from militia accustomed to short-term service and local control. He managed to force British evacuation of Boston in March 1776 by fortifying Dorchester Heights with artillery, but the British simply moved their forces to New York, which they captured in a campaign that nearly destroyed Washington's army. The defeats around New York in late 1776 brought the Revolution to its lowest point. Washington's forces retreated across New Jersey with the British pursuing. Enlistments were expiring. The army was dissolving. The cause appeared lost. On Christmas night, 1776, Washington crossed the ice-filled Delaware River and attacked a Hessian garrison at Trenton, capturing nearly 1,000 German mercenaries. A week later, he defeated British forces at Princeton. These victories, though tactically small, demonstrated American forces could win battles and provided hope when hope was desperately needed. The 1777 campaign brought mixed results. British forces under General John Burgoyne invaded from Canada, intending to split the colonies by controlling the Hudson River Valley. But Burgoyne's army became overextended, lost supplies, and faced growing opposition. At Saratoga in October 1777, American forces surrounded and captured Burgoyne's entire army of nearly 6,000 men. The Saratoga victory proved to be the Revolution's turning point, not because of the tactical results, but because it convinced France that American independence was achievable. France had been providing covert aid since early in the war, hoping to weaken Britain. But Saratoga demonstrated Americans could win major victories. In February 1778, France signed treaties of alliance and commerce with the United States, committing to war against Britain until American independence was secured. French entry transformed the conflict. Britain now faced a global war against multiple enemies. The Royal Navy had to defend the home islands, protect the West Indies, and maintain communications with India. Resources that might have crushed the rebellion had to be dispersed. Yet the winter of 1777 to 1778, which Washington's army spent at Valley Forge, demonstrated American vulnerability. The army suffered terribly from inadequate food, clothing, and shelter. Thousands died from disease and exposure. Desertions mounted. Congress struggled to provide supplies. The continental dollar depreciated rapidly. State governments often failed to meet their obligations. What held the army together was leadership. Washington's personal commitment, despite frustrations with Congress and state governments, set an example. Baron von Steuben, a Prussian officer, drilled the troops in professional tactics and discipline. By spring, The Continental Army that emerged from Valley Forge was a more effective fighting force than the militia that had begun the war. The war's geography shifted southward in 1778. British strategy aimed to exploit Loyalist support in the southern colonies. They captured Savannah and Charleston, inflicting the war's worst American defeat when Charleston surrendered with more than 5,000 Continental soldiers. British forces under Lord Cornwallis marched through the Carolinas, winning battles but unable to establish lasting control over a hostile countryside where partisan warfare made British occupation costly. By 1781, the war had reached a stalemate. Britain controlled major port cities but faced persistent resistance in rural areas. American finances were near collapse. The Continental Army struggled to maintain numbers as enlistments expired. The French alliance provided crucial naval support, but came with obligations and complexities. Cornwallis's army moved into Virginia in 1781, eventually establishing a base at Yorktown on the Chesapeake Bay. Washington saw an opportunity. If French naval forces could control the Chesapeake, while American and French ground forces surrounded Yorktown, Cornwallis would be trapped. The coordination required was extraordinary. Washington marched his army from New York to Virginia. French forces under Count Rochambeau joined him. The French fleet under Admiral de Grasse defeated British naval forces attempting to relieve Yorktown. By late September, Cornwallis faced American and French armies numbering more than 16,000 and a French fleet controlling the bay. He was trapped. The siege of Yorktown lasted 3 weeks. Allied artillery bombarded British positions. Cornwallis attempted to evacuate across the York River, but a storm prevented it. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered his army of more than 7,000 men. Yorktown effectively ended major combat operations. Fighting continued in some areas, but the British government, facing opposition at home and costs mounting from global war, began seeking terms. Peace negotiations in Paris produced the Treaty of Paris, signed in September 1783. Britain recognized American independence and granted territory extending from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River and from the Great Lakes to Florida. The American Revolution demonstrated that colonial subjects could successfully break from empire and establish self-governing institutions. This was unprecedented in modern history. Previous colonial rebellions had either been crushed by imperial forces or produced unstable regimes quickly overthrown by internal divisions or external intervention. The United States, despite enormous challenges, including military defeats, economic collapse, and internal disagreements, created a functioning republic that endured. The revolution succeeded because multiple factors converged at a unique historical moment. British strategic errors, particularly the decision to impose new taxes and administrative regulations on colonies accustomed to substantial autonomy, united disparate colonies that otherwise competed and distrusted each other in common opposition. American leadership, especially George Washington's ability to hold the Continental Army together through desperate periods when dissolution seemed certain, provided continuity when collapse appeared imminent. The French alliance brought resources, military expertise, and naval power that America alone could not match against the world's dominant empire. And American determination, the willingness of soldiers to continue fighting and civilians to support the cause despite defeats, hardships, and years without clear path to victory, eventually wore down British willingness to continue an increasingly unpopular and expensive war. The Revolution's principles, articulated most powerfully in the Declaration of Independence and later embedded in state and federal constitutions, influenced democratic movements worldwide for generations. The idea that legitimate government requires the consent of the governed challenged monarchical systems across Europe and inspired independence movements throughout Latin America in the 19th century. The revolution demonstrated that republican government, long thought by political theorists to be suitable only for small city-states where citizens knew each other, could function effectively in a large nation spanning vast territory. Yet the revolution left fundamental contradictions unresolved that would shape American history for centuries. The Declaration proclaimed that all men are created equal and possess unalienable rights, while many of its authors, including Jefferson himself, held enslaved people as property. Women gained no political rights despite their essential contributions to the revolutionary cause through managing farms and businesses, organizing boycotts, and sometimes directly supporting military operations. Native Americans found their territorial claims and sovereignty ignored as American settlement pushed relentlessly westward across lands they had inhabited for millennia. These failures and contradictions would produce conflicts, including a devastating civil war that haunted American development. The Revolution also demonstrated the persistent fragility of Republican government and the difficulty of translating revolutionary ideals into stable institutions. The Articles of Confederation, adopted during the war to provide some framework for cooperation among the states, created a weak central government that struggled to manage war debts, regulate interstate commerce, maintain a functioning currency, or enforce international treaties. Within a few years of independence, the system's inadequacies forced a constitutional convention that would create the federal system under which the United States still operates, though even that required intense debate and narrow ratification. The American Revolution teaches that successful independence requires not just military victory over imperial power, but the much harder task of creating stable institutions and resolving fundamental political questions about who possesses rights, how power should be distributed, and what principles should govern society. The Revolution achieved the first through 8 years of warfare, French assistance, and British exhaustion. The second required generations of conflict, political struggle, constitutional amendments, and social movements, and remains an ongoing project more than 2 centuries later. The Revolution's ultimate significance lies not in the perfect achievement of its stated ideals, which its leaders manifestly failed to accomplish, but in establishing principles and aspirations against which American society could be measured and toward which it could be pushed to progress. The revolution that began in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence concluded formally in 1783 with British recognition of American sovereignty in the Treaty of Paris. 8 years of warfare had transformed 13 separate colonies into a unified nation. The costs were substantial in blood and treasure. Tens of thousands died in combat or from disease in military camps. Economic disruption damaged trade networks and destroyed property. Loyalists who had supported the Crown fled to Canada, Britain, or the Caribbean, their property confiscated and their lives uprooted. Yet the experiment in Republican government survived its difficult birth and would profoundly shape the modern world's understanding of democracy, individual rights, and the relationship between citizens and their government.